Across the world, across the centuries, civilizations that had nothing else in common kept arriving at the same idea, the sword. From Europe to Japan, the martial schools that taught weapon use often placed the sword at the center. Cultures without mythology carved sword-like weapons from wood, obsidian, even shark teeth. Wherever humans fought, the sword kept showing up, and kept earning a status no other weapon quite matched. Popular culture has always leaned into that status and exaggerated it, but over the last decade the pendulum has swung hard the other way. Some YouTube historians argue the spear was the real king of the battlefield, that swords were just sidearms, backup tools, the pistol to the spear's rifle. Some people go further and call the spear the ultimate weapon outright. But historical accounts, tactical manuals, and archaeological evidence tell a different story. History gives us soldiers who carried swords as the primary weapon, sometimes specifically deployed against spear formations. One example comes from the Italian wars, where Spanish rodeleros, swordsmen armed with sword and buckler, were used to disrupt enemy pike formations. The tactics employed by these swordsmen are detailed in the chronicle describing the Alps of Spain and Italy. These troops were specifically intended to close the distance and fight where long weapons became difficult to use. We see similar examples among the German Landsknechts. Some elite soldiers known as Doppelsoldner were equipped with massive two-handed swords and paid double wages. Contemporary illustrations often depict them positioned at the front of formations, where their weapons could be used to disrupt enemy pikes or engage opposing elite troops. And the idea of swords overcoming long spears isn't limited to the Renaissance. The Romans faced Greek phalanxes armed with sarissas, massive spears designed to keep enemies at a distance. Yet the Romans consistently managed to close in, break formation, and use their swords to devastating effect. These weren't accidents or last resorts. Across centuries, armies deliberately chose swords as primary weapons and built entire fighting doctrines around them. When people picture medieval battles, they often imagine long weapons keeping enemies at a distance, but once formations collided, that distance quickly disappeared. Spears broke, ranks collapsed, and the fight turned into dense melee. And when that happened, the weapon that carried the fight forward was often the sword. The chronicler Jan Długosz, describing the Battle of Grunwald, gives a vivid account of this moment, when the spears broke and the fighting devolved into close combat. Once the formations compressed, the battles continued largely with swords and axes at arm's length. This wasn't an accident or a last-minute improvisation. Close combat was an expected phase of battle, and soldiers carried swords because they knew they would need them. And it wasn't just Grunwald. Military writers from the pike and sword era described the same pattern. The French theorist Fornovo, building on ideas from Machiavelli, argued that once the melee closed, pikemen should drop their pikes and fight with swords and bucklers. Other Italian military writers from the same period also noted that shorter weapons, swords, halberds, and similar arms, continued to play an important role in the hands of skirmishing troops. These were systemic expectations. Close combat was inevitable, and everyone knew it. The idea appears even early in military literature. Vigilius, whose work Terra Militari was widely read throughout the Middle Ages, describes the sword as the soldier's chief weapon. In some cases, swords weren't just useful after the clash, they were seen as better from the start. At the Battle of Fornovo, the physician Alessandro Benedetti observed that although the French carried shorter lances, they seemed better suited to the sword. For as it is shorter, it is on that account considered better. The YouTube historians say the sword was the pistol, a last resort when the real weapon failed. But these men hadn't lost their spears. They just preferred the sword. But what does the archaeology tell us? Let's start with the Battle of Wisby. From Armour from the Battle of Wisby. We can see that cutting weapons dominate the wound profile, 456 cases. Even though the author couldn't always distinguish between swords and axes, the fact remains. These are blade wounds, not thrusts. Now compare that to the 126 piercing wounds. And remember, lance wounds were lumped in with arrows, meaning we can't clearly attribute any percentage of wounds to spears. Next, let's look at Towton, from Blood Red Roses. Again, the majority are cuts, not stabs. These wounds are to the skull, deep enough to reach the brain, and in many cases indicate multiple, repeated strikes. Thrust wounds appear only in 2 individuals, making them statistical outliers. Now, onto the Battle of Uppsala. The trauma distribution diagrams make the pattern visually obvious. The surviving skeletal injuries are dominated by cut marks, especially across the skull. The article does mention puncture wounds, but only 4, and it explicitly says there were too few to be dealt with in the study. So, this is not a strong record of thrusting, it is primarily a record of men being cut. There are other studies that I'm not gonna go into, with the exact same pattern. Peri-mortem trauma, dominated by cuts, not thrusts. If spears were the dominant weapon, what are the spear wounds? We've looked at historical troops who specifically used swords as primary weapons, often as a deliberate tool of choice against spear formations. We've seen soldiers drop their pikes mid-battle to pick up swords. And when we look at the bodies, the pattern is unambiguous. Cuts dominate, thrusts don't. Both swords and spears could start a battle, but it was the swords who finished them. And when armies needed to break spear formations, they didn't send more spears, they sent swordsmen. So maybe the sword didn't earn its iconic status just because it looks cool, though it certainly does. Maybe it earned it because across centuries, across cultures, when it was put against the spear, it won.